Welcome to your Healing Place podcast with Linda and Mindy. It is our desire to address common concerns of how abortion and faith intersect in order to validate the emotional pain and grief that abortion can bring and give hope that recovery is possible. Well, we're back with your Healing Place podcast with Linda and Mindy. And Christy J is our guest once again. And we're going to talk about the role that grief plays in healing. And grief is a really tough subject in the terms of it's easy to talk about, but it's something that we all usually avoid or want to avoid or beat ourselves up for if we can't avoid it, right? Somehow we think there's something wrong with us because we're just sobbing and weeping and wailing.
Or just stuffing it, but suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess we could go right into that. Why is grief so scary? And why do we avoid it? I mean, what's grief like in your life? I can share with you in my life that grief is kind of depends on what is surrounding, Sometimes grief turns into anger in an instant for me. Anger is always my go-to for protection because I don't want to be hurt, because grief is a vulnerability. You feel vulnerable. But sometimes it just turns into tears and depression. So grief can look multiple different ways for me. And I know somebody in my life who grief looks the same. She stuffs it and stuffs it. And if she has to cry, she kicks you out of her house and out of her life for that moment. Like you've done something wrong and it's not your fault. So it's just happened directly to me. So grief looks different with everybody, but it's scary because because it's vulnerable. I guess that would be.
And our society just doesn't accept it. I mean, you look at the biblical society or many other cultures today, and they are very forthcoming with the mourning and the ashes and sackcloth and a very vocal kind of thing. And I think just society wise, we don't know what to do with grief. At a funeral, they say, "Oh, isn't she brave? She's not even crying." Well, maybe she should be crying,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why the Jewish faith, I mean, you've got people coming into the home and staying there to sit Shiva for days. In a community kind of setting where they are acknowledging your grief. And that's part of the problem with abortion is our society doesn't even acknowledge a loss, much less our grief.
Right, right. So where do we take that? We just in decades past we had to stuff it.
Mhm.
Um,
But it's healthy. It's healthy to be able to truly grieve. Tears are an amazing thing. God has made tears not only just emotionally, but physiologically. Tears rebalance our chemistry.
mm,
They release
mm.
toxins, so stuffing it is not leading us to healing, to be able to, and that's what we try to do with a lot of our memorial services, is put people into a context where they have freedom, are allowed and even pushed towards being able to express that grief. Grief, it has to have an expression. And if it's an expression in community with other people that are also valuing that process, it's even stronger.
Yeah, and I'd say grief has to have an outlet because
Yeah,
without that outlet, unresolved grief turns into all kinds of very destructive, potentially destructive behaviors like alcoholism, drug use, prescription medicine use, cutting. It turns into
like,
being overly controlling, you
like you
know,
mentioned, anger.
sexual promiscuity, yes, depression, isolation. So unresolved grief comes out in a bunch of different ways. With abortion, it's not like we are habitually sinning, generally speaking. And for women who had their abortions decades ago, they don't even know that some of these behaviors are a result of unresolved grief because
Mhm.
they have stuffed it so long and so quickly, they just started to move on. But like you said, it has to have an outlet or it dams up.
And our
And
mothers' hearts know there's been a loss, and we've got to grieve that loss.
yes. And I had a lady come to us last year. She was in her late 60s and or early 70s and she's like, I had my abortion 50 some years ago, and I've never
Mm.
grieved the loss of my child, and I need to go through this for that. And it was the memorial piece that she needed. You know, the rest of the pieces, she had been in Bible study for so long, so anger and depression and talking about all these other pieces, but it was the memorial piece, the connecting with her child, that was her outlet to get that out. And she just experienced utter freedom.
And you mentioned early on, as we started talking just now, why is it so scary? I think it's scary because we just don't know what to expect. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know that people are going to accept us and walk along with us. They're going to think we're crazy because society thinks we're crazy for grieving for our children. And we don't want to be messy, sobbing, snotty messes. We don't know. We don't really know what's going to come out. We know it's so deep and so far down in there that if we take that lid off, we're not sure exactly how it's going to look.
So true. And we're
But
going to
when we
lose
do it in a
control.
safe spot, when we do
Mm-hmm.
it in a safe spot, when we're in group with where we've walked with each other for a period of weeks or of days, depending on the type of group you're in, these women are going through the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have a safe spot where that lid can
Mm-hmm.
come off
Mm-hmm.
and we can express it.
Yeah. Yeah. And leaders who have walked the journey. And so they can be there with you. And Christy, in our pre session here for this, you talked about how grief softens us,
Mm,
Yeah.
or may I say, unresolved grief hardens us. And just what I was mentioning, some of the symptoms of unresolved grief, and those are all hardening effects,
Yeah.
and it doesn't soften us to be tender towards the Lord, to be tender towards our kids, to be tender towards people in general. It hardens our emotions, our personality.
Yeah. And desensitizes ourselves to other people's suffering. I think for me,
Yes.
grief for a long time was to ignore. I wanted to ignore those problems and think that they were in the past. And I never really turned around and grieved whatever it was that I needed to grieve. And it seemed like the thing was scary and big and too much to deal with. So walking away would have been turning my back on it. It's easier. But when I did turn around and started to face some of these problems with the Lord, they weren't as big and scary as I had thought.
mm,
And the process of going through that was healing, and at which, you have to be vulnerable. But when your back is turned on something, you have to be pretty hardened to ignore pain, to ignore it.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was inspired by the many conversations had through the years with women struggling from the emotional pain associated with abortion. Thank you for allowing us into your healing journey. Subscribe on major platforms where podcasts can be heard. Learn more about virtual abortion recovery healing at www.anevenplace.com. The link is in the show notes.